Lekut Sichos Chelik Chav Beis Vayikra Beis Elili Nishmis Reb Yosef Binyamin ben Reb Menashe Kaltman. A phenomenal Sicha. We're going to begin in the area of Nigla de Torah. We're going to be discussing the concept of Nidvas HaEitzim, of donating wood to the Beis Hamikdash, and ultimately the way to understand this is going to be from the perspective of Chassidus, although it's based on a Ramban, and this connects. This is from two Farbrengens from Chaf Av, which is the yahrzeit of the Rebbe's father. And one of the things that the Gemara tells us about the 20th of Av was that it was a day that was celebrated for donating wood to the Beis Hamikdash. And we're going to learn what is the halachic ramification of that, and what is the practical, personal, avoidedike ramifications of that. Let us begin. Von dem Pasuk. V'nefesh kisakriv karban mincha. The pasuk in this week's parashas Vayikra, a person, a soul that will offer a karban mincha. When a statement kisakriv mincha, it doesn't just say he'll offer a mincha, but he adds in the word karban. Let it been up in Teras Kehanim. The Teras Kehanim learns as min ken min nadiv zayin als karban bifnei atzmei oich leveina yayin shemen, that a person can give as a donation to the Beis Hamikdash as its own independent karban, levaina, which is one of the spices of the Ketores and was also put an ingredient in the karban mincha, yayin wine, shemen oil, l'chakumen zusammen mit dem karban, which usually normally come together, are part of a karban. If a person decides to give it as its own karban, he wants to donate wine or oil or spices, levaina spice, that's going to be placed on the Mizbeach as its own independent karban, he may do so. This is learned from the pasuk karban. Un oich eitzim, also wood. Generally, wood is used for the fire on the Mizbeach, but if a person wants to give a donation of wood as a karban, he can do so. Learned from the pasuk, from the word karban in this pasuk. Darf man verstehen, so we must understand. The fact that the word karban can include the spice, levaina, the wine, the oil, as its own independent karban is moving, is understood. Since anyway they are part of a karban, a karban consists of these ingredients. Haben sie have sich kedushas und dem shem karban, so they carry the name and therefore the holiness of a karban, and therefore if the person decides to give this karban, this item independently, it works. How would the word karban include wood that are not part of a karban? You say the word nefesh kisakriv karban, so I can learn that anything that is part of a karban could become a karban itself. But if the wood is not part of a karban, it's on the mizbeach, it's making a fire, but it's not an ingredient of a karban. So how does the word karban include eitzim, include wood? In Gemara wird gebracht. So the Gemara actually also learns the same limud, or a similar limud, as the Teras Kehanim. Karban, from the word karban, melamich misnadvin eitzim, this teaches us that you're allowed to donate wood. V'cheinu oimer, and the Gemara brings a raya, a pasuk, v'hagirolei sipalnu al karban ha'eitzim, pasuk in Nehemiah about the time of Ezra, when it says we threw lots as to who will donate the wood. Is Rashi Mefaros? Rashi explains v'cheinu oimer. What's the raya? The eitzim karban mikru. The Gemara or the Braisa is bringing a raya that eitzim, that wood, could be referred to as a karban. Das heißt, v'adning gefindt in pasuk the eitzim karban mikru. So what's the raya? Since we find karban ha'eitzim, that wood is considered a karban, can the word karban marbez on eitzim? So therefore, the word karban in our pasuk can also include wood. So the Rebbe asks on this, but this is not a raya. This pasuk can serve as a raya, as a proof that there is a place where wood is called karban. But doesn't explain the reasoning. Farvazol and eitzim hasten carbon. When mele kennen ze nichel werden in the lashon takiv carbon. Why would eitzim be referred to as a carbon? That they are referred to as a carbon that we can accept from the pasuk carbon ha'eitzim. But why? How does wood get the name carbon? And because of that, be included in the word carbon to be allowed to bring as a carbon. The wood merely facilitates the mitzvah, or facilitates the carbon in this case. Their carbons will kind of have been invented. In order for the carbon to be burned, we need to have wood, and which will make a fire. Now, the Rebbe continues to explain. Wenn gets anders gefunden as eitzim werden gebracht als a tail von our carbon. If there'll be another place besides for this pasuk, our pasuk of carbon, where it tells us that eitzim is part of a carbon, dan ersvalt is gonna tam dan. That would be a raya. The word carbon is marba eitzim. That if wood is part of a carbon, then the word carbon could include eitzim, like we said about the yain and the shemen, the levina, because they're part of a carbon. Therefore, they could be their own carbon as well. But over here, it doesn't tell us that the eitzim was part of the carbon. It's talking about a donation of wood, not as a carbon. It's just using the word carbon. So that itself needs to be understood. And to go a little bit deeper into this question, even on a more subtle way, der pasuk va'agirolisi palmal carbon ha'etzim redegen carbon etzim et ha'yidiyah. The pasuk over there says that the carbon, that the girdle was made on the, doesn't say carbon etzim, a carbon of wood, carbon ha'etzim, the carbon of the wood. As Avius is yodua from frier as a carbon etzim, being that we already know that there is a concept of carbon ha'etzim. The pasuk as there is gebrach on al the pasuk is telling us that this carbon of wood that we know is a carbon was brought through a girdle, through a lot. But where is the mucker of that? In other words, the fact that then in the time of Ezra, they brought a carbon of wood is an outcome from this discussion that we're having here in Teras Keinim and in the Gemara. As misnadvim eitzim kumt uis, as men bringt a raya, as misnadvim eitzim. Because over here in our Teras Keinim and our Gemara, it says that you can donate wood. Therefore, over there, they brought a carbon eitzim. Kumt uis, as men bringt a raya fun der misuvav after siba. You're bringing a raya from the outcome to the cause. We don't even know in the cause yet why eitzim is considered a carbon. And you're already bringing me a raya to something that was learned from this that wasn't learned yet. It's like a circular logic. You're going around and you're learning the carbon ha'eitzim from our pasuk carbon. And you're learning our pasuk carbon from the carbon ha'eitzim. So this is our first question. This is the basic main question of the Sikha. What is it about eitzim, about wood, that allows it to be called carbon, that because of that we could learn from the pasuk carbon, excuse me, because that we can learn from the pasuk carbon, that you could bring eitzim as a carbon, b'fnei atzmei as an independent carbon. So in Sif Beis, the Rebbe is going to suggest a reasoning and answer, and the Rebbe is going to refute it. Seemingly we could answer this question, but first let's introduce this following idea. As an there's two ways, there's two categories that for which you can donate wood. Number one, you're donating wood for the pyre. Eitzim, wood that was used to make a fire on the Mizbeach, on which we would be makriv, on which we would offer and burn other karbanos. That's one thing. The Beis Hamidrash needed wood, and a person can donate wood, which would be used for the fire. Beis means the eitzim gufa makriv of Mizbeach. Another way is that the eitzim themselves are being brought on the Mizbeach outside carbon b'fnei atzmei, not to be burned to serve another carbon, but it would be part of its own carbon. Oh, later day, as the dinah now from misnadvim eitzim meant nid was eitzim to the lishke faratzei maracha, nor as men can bring in eitzim as a carbon from the. Now the Gemara has a machlokes between Rebbe and Rabbanan. When the Brisa says misnadvim eitzim, does it mean you're donating wood for as a carbon, or does it mean that you're bringing wood as for the maracha? Wood that could be used on the fire. So Rebbe holds that when it says misnadvim eitzim, it means that you could not just use it for the wood, for the fire on the mizbeach, but it means you could bring it as a carbon. So if you follow this day, that misnadvim eitzim means that you're allowed to donate the wood as a carbon bifnei atzmai. The shita from the Rebbe, as is the shita of Rebbe in the Gemara in Menachos. And not only that, Rebbe says more than that. As the eitzim of an ala dinim from our carbon, that this wood now has the din, all the dinim of a carbon. To urin melach, you have to bring salt like you would in any other carbon. Hagasha, you have to bring it to the corner of the mizbeach. Kmitza, you have to take off a handful and burn it on the mizbeach. Eitzim, tzrichim, eitzim, that this wood would need its own wood. Because if you need wood for a carbon, then you would need wood for this wood. In other words, Rebbe holds that this wood is a regular carbon, and all of the accoutrements that go along with the carbon go along with this. Uledas Ravid. Now the Ravid says that even the Rabbanon who hold that that you don't need to have all these things, the Ravid learns that even the Rabbanon agree with Rebbe that you could bring this wood as a carbon. The chilik is nar, but later the Rabbanon by the eitzim the dinim now. The difference would be that the Rabbanon hold that all these dinim of bringing salt and hagasha, etc., are not necessary. Else is nitken carbon gober because they hold it's not a full-fledged carbon. But they would agree that it could be in a certain element, a certain part of it could be a carbon b'fnei atzmai. So now, if we go according to Rebbe, or for that matter, according to the Rabbanon, the way that Ravid learns that there is an inyan of bringing this wood onto this beyach, and now we can answer the question. The pasuk about the lots in the time of Ezra is talking about wood for the fire. But of the sibah from the Gerolis is given because the whole reason why they made the Gerolis was, the Gemara itself, as the Gemara tells, as limatzu eitzim belishka, then they came back from Galus. They couldn't find wood in the chamber that stored the wood. So these families were donating wood for the fire and the mizbeach in order to bring karbanis, as we will elaborate in Siv Dalit. So now, since the wood for the maracha, for the fire, is being referred to as a carbon, is there from carbon? This means that the wood that's being used for the fire is considered part of the carbon, unlike the way we thought until now, that it's just facilitating the carbon. We're saying now that from the pasuk we're learning that if you're donating wood for the fire, it's considered as if it's part of the carbon. Can there fire the word carbon marbezain eitzim? So then in that case, the word carbon could include wood as its own, as we can say that even if you wanted to bring an independent carbon out of wood, you can do so. Just like the yayin and the levina, for example, which we said before, because they're ingredients in a carbon, therefore they could be a carbon b'fnei atzma, they could be their own independent carbon. Similarly, because when bringing wood for the fire, we refer to it as carbon, this means that it is considered a chelik, an ingredient of the carbon, and therefore we could learn from that to another kind of nidvas ha'etzim, the one in our pasuk, which is making it a carbon b'fnei atzmai, that is part of the carbon, and therefore it can be brought as its own carbon as well. Aber. However, says the Rebbe, this doesn't work. Besides the fact, as Eben nemt on as mekem makim and eitzmal mizbeach as a carbon b'fnei atzmai, that if we were to accept that you're allowed to donate wood on the mizbeach as its own carbon, is mistaber tzuzagen as the lashon v'agirol is gamer carbon ha'etzim meant, then we would say possibly that when it says carbon ha'etzim in Ezra, meant need not the eitzim that we would interpret that to mean not just wood for the fire, that as the mishpachas of an echt von die eitzim sheis nadvu gebracht euch carbon eitzim al mizbeach. We would then say that that we threw lots for the carbon of wood. Maybe that doesn't mean the wood for the fire, like we said in the previous paragraph. Maybe it means that they actually brought a carbon of wood, and the Ritva Taka learns like this. That carbon eitzim refers to wood that was offered on the Mizbeach. So then again, you would lose your raya. Because if they're both talking about carbon, a carbon of wood, bifnei atzmai, then you lose your proof, because they're both the same thing. You can't learn anymore that the eitzim is part of a carbon, because the eitzim is the carbon. And how do you know that? You know that they're from here. How do you know to hear from there? So you're back to your same question. So point number one that the Rebbe is making is that if you are to accept that a wood could be a carbon, then you don't anymore know that wood is part of a carbon. And in addition to that, later days that didn't from the Mishnah Veitzon das Baron is Bala Lamed as Oison Gezedim Krevim LaHechsher HaKabbana Salam Amaracha. This whole argument only works according to Rebbe, or according to the Rabbanon, the way that Ravid learns. But according to the Shita of the Rabbanon, the way it's understood in the Gemara, that Misnadvim Eitzim means that a person could donate wood, and that this wood would then be used for fire on the Mizbeach, not as a carbon. Kommt doch aus, that din from Misnadvim Eitzim is the Zelberim V'Agaralzi Palmal Carbon Eitzim, that again they're the same thing. Then the wood over there was for the fire, the wood over here is also for the fire. Is Hadar Kushi Ledukta. Then again, we're back to our original question. Where do we have a raya that wood is part of a carbon to make it, to learn that you're allowed to use it as its own independent carbon? So, the Rebbe tried to create that there's two different types of carbonis of eitzim, two different types of donations of eitzim. One for the maracha and one as an actual carbon. And then you wanted to say that we could learn from one to the other, meaning to say from carbon or eitzim, that the eitzim is part of the carbon and therefore it could be an actual carbon. But the Rebbe says, for two reasons, it doesn't work. Either also by carbon or eitzim, it means a carbon of actual wood, or according to the Rabbanon, by misnadvim eitzim, it means for the wood of the Mizbeach. And again, they're both the same thing, and they're dependent on each other, and we have no independent raya that eitzim could be a carbon. Musbenzak and different Siv Gimel, the Rebbe concludes, as the Ikir Tam Farvaster carbon is Marbe, Eitzim is the initial Svara. There's nowhere in Torah that we could, no pasuk that we could use as a raya that the eitzim is part of the carbon, and therefore we must conclude that it's a logical thing. That since the wood of the pyre is being burned on the mizbeach together with the carbon, they are considered part of the carbon. But it's only as an extra raya that the pasuk that the Gemara brings, and by introducing the words v'cheinu oimer for state befedish the lashon carbon negel eitzim. So he's bringing an extra raya where you actually see the term carbon for eitzim. But why carbon is called eitzim? That is going to be an inyan shel svara and not an inyan shel pasuk or raya. And the way I understand the sikha is that this doesn't change. Even though we're about to ask a question, that question will be answered. But this maskana doesn't change. That the fact that the Teras Kayanim and the Gemara say that you can donate wood to the Mizbeach as a carbon, and you're going to ask the question in 1 second, how is the wood a carbon? The answer is very simple. It's a svara. Because the wood is such an integral part of the carbon, even though it's not an ingredient in the carbon, but it's so necessary as part of the carbon, and it gets burned together with the Mizbeach, with the carbon on the Mizbeach, therefore it's considered part of the carbon, and therefore it can also be its own independent carbon. However, we have to understand. How does the svara work? We just explained earlier that the wood really serves more to facilitate the carbon than to be part of a carbon. In order to offer a carbon, you need fire. Which comes through, which is the fire is made with wood. So that just facilitates the carbon. That is not necessarily part of the carbon. So the way I understand that what's going to happen now is not that the Rebbe is refuting the svara. The Rebbe is not that the Rebbe is refuting the idea that it's inyan shel svara. The Rebbe says we have to explain the svara, however. So in the Hemshech HaSicha, the Rebbe is going to go deeper into this whole concept of nidvas ha'etzim, the donating of wood that took place in those dates of carbon ha'etzim that were referred to in the pasuk of the Gedolos. And as we delve deeper into it, we're going to understand how integral the wood is, and therefore we're going to understand how that it's part of a carbon. And because of that, we're going to go back to this svara that because it's so integrally part of the carbon, therefore it is included in the word carbon in the pasuk in our parsha. So let's go back. So let's go back inside. Seif Dalid. We're now going to step back a little bit, and we're going to delve into this idea of the nidvas ha'etzim, the donation of wood to the Beis Hamikdash that took place in the time of Ezra. But again, the meaning of nidvas ha'etzim gefim and advar pella, and with this regard, we find something incredible. In the Mishnah, in Gerechen Tishas Manu von Atzia Keren Avam, the Mishnah lists 9 dates in the year that were celebrated as the days of the wood for the Kohanim, for the people. The Gemara is this mas, the Gemara explains when the people came up from Golos and they wanted to restart the Avodah in the Beis Hamikdash, they found that the chamber of wood was empty. So there were certain families that donated wood for the fire on the Mizbeach. And therefore it was established by the Chachamim of that time. As b'chol shana v'shana, that every year is on the mishpachas bringen etzim in dem selben tag when sie haben gebracht etzim pamar shena, that these families every year should bring wood on the same date that they brought the wood the first time. Und in dem tag nutzmen sie the etzim, and on that day they would the Beis Hamikdash would use their wood that they donated, even if the chamber was filled with wood. There was enough wood in the lishka. Nevertheless, on this day they would use specifically the wood that was donated by this family. These dates were actually a yomtiv for these families. They were not allowed to make hespedim. They were not allowed to be sad and say eulogies, which is a sadness, an expression of sadness. Ubetainis, you're not allowed to fast. Ubasiyas malacha, you're not allowed to do malacha. Bis v'di gemara erzählt, as it says deicha afilu dem tainis from Tisha B'av nidcha. One of the dates was Yud Av. So if Tisha B'av fell out on Shabbos and Sunday Yud Av was Tisha B'av nidcha, was a postponed Tisha B'av, this family wouldn't fast even on Tisha B'av. That was a nidcha. So the question becomes, for us, why is it such a great simcha? Because it's such a great simcha that it overrides the tightness of Tisha B'av nidcha. So some of the Achreinim explain, at the time when their simcha is not to live the nidvas eitzim l'maracha kshalatma. The reason of the joy in those days is not because of the fact that wood was donated to the Mizbeach, because this family would also bring oilus as a nedava, as a donation, as a gift to the Beis Hamikdash. Laid them din as their tag was bring a carbon is a yontif. And there's a din that says that a day that a person brings a carbon is a yomtiv for that person. So the Achreinim say we're not celebrating donating wood. We're celebrating the carbonis that are being brought on that day. But that's not simple. Even though according to these Achreinim, the actual celebration, the actual fact that we're celebrating is because there were Eilis Nedava on that day. But why are we bringing Eilis Nedava? The Siba of them Gufa was the reason that we established, instituted, to bring the Nedava, the Karbanis on that day, because it's the day of the donating of the wood. So you're still going back to the fact that this day, the day of the donating of the wood, is a day of great joy, and therefore we were masakin karbanis, and therefore we don't fast, and it overrides Tisha B'av. So you still doesn't answer the question. Nachmer. Let's take this a step further. The fact that we're overriding the fast of Tisha B'av nitcha, the fast day, is nit mitzad hakravas ha'eilus nedava mitzad atzma. It's not only because of the karbanis. Varum inatog v'm is mechuyev to fasten, because in a day that you're obligated to fast. We wouldn't allow a person to bring a carbon oilus nedava and that way override the fast day. A random a tiny sister. person's going to say, oh, I'll bring a carbon adava and I don't have to fast. We don't allow that. Nor, it's just because the donating of the wood was established in a certain way, as in Demtag is a Makrevelis Adava, he says, and because we established the day of the donating of the wood as a day of Karbanis, therefore it is Deichid the Tainus. So we really, what is the underlying factor of this day? It's the day of the donating of the wood. So we have to understand. We need explanation. Midvas is nidvas eitz maza'in in gadol. Why is the donating of the wood such a great thing? As to libdem hotman kriveag when the yom tevim fosman atzei hakern and va'am, that we established these days of the wood as a yom tiv, as a day of celebration, so much so that we are overriding the tainus, the fast day. Oh, so that's another question. So we still have to explain the svara. Why is eitzim considered part of a carbon? If it's only machshirei mitzvah, it's only facilitating a carbon. We now have another question that we're introducing is why is the simcha of the donating of the wood such a great simcha? And then in Sifei we're going to talk about another aspect in the preparation of the wood that also generates a very, very serious simcha. In addition to the simcha that was in the time of donating the wood, we also find in Chazal, we also find in the teachings of our sages that there is a special joy in the time of the cutting of the wood. The Gemara says, as Einer from the timim after Simcha for Chamisha Asar B'Av. One of the reasons why Chamisha Asar B'Av is such a great day of joy, as we're going to quote in a moment, it says that there are not any other Yomim Tovim that are as great as Chamisha Asar B'Av, the 15th of Av, and Yom Kippur. So the Gemara says, because it's the day that they finished chopping the wood for the fire of the Mizbeach. The Gemara explains that after the 15th of Av, the sun, the strength of the sun diminishes. It's not as hot outside. And because of that, the wood could begin to get rotten and not fit for the Mizbeach. The wetness, the cold, it does not bode well for the wood. So they would stop chopping wood for the Mizbeach on the 15th of Av. This is before in the Rishonim is the Simcha der Farbas Be'Yisayim Yom Hashlimim U'Mesaymin Mitzvah Gedela Kazos. And the Rishonim explain that on this day, the conclusion, the fact that they had completed this incredible mitzvah, was a day of great joy. And this is actually the reason why there is such a great simcha on Chamisha Asar B'Av. As the Mishnah says, there have not been any greater Yomim Tovim for Yidden than the 15th of Av and Yom Kippur. From Bir HaMarsha, we can understand this. The way the Marsha explains. These two ideas the Mishnah brings as a proof to the concept of Simcha and Yom Tov. And just to explain what we're talking about, the Mishnah says, in this Mishnah that is talking about the Simcha of Chamisha Asar B'Av and Yom Kippur, it says, V'cheinu Omer, and he brings the pasuk, Tze'ena U're'ena B'nai Tzion. The Melech Shlomo come out, daughters of Tzion, of Yerushalayim, and see. Melech Shlomo, the king Shlomo, Ba'atara Shatara Le'ima, the crown that his mother crowned him with. B'yem Chasanasi, in the day of his wedding, U'v'yem Simchas Liba, and in the day of the joy of his heart. That's the pasuk. So the Mishnah explains, B'yem Chasanasi is a Matan Torah, the day of the wedding of and Melech Shlomo is a euphemism to the Eibishter, Shah Shalom Shaloi, the Eibishter who is the Eibishter of peace. So Melech Shlomo, in the way we're learning the pasuk, is a reference to the Eibishter. And B'yem Chasanasi, the day of his wedding, is the day of Matan Torah, when the Eibishter married the Yidden. U'v'yem Simchas Liba, the day of the joy of his heart, that's the day of the Beis Hamikdash. So these two times, Matan Torah and Binyan Beis Hamikdash, are the days of the Eibishter's greatest joy. Now, in this Mishnah, we say that B'yom Chasanasai and B'yom Simchas Libai is Yom Kippur and Chamisha Asar B'Av. And so the Maharsha explains that this pasuk, which the Gemara is bringing as a raya to the Eibusher Simcha, V'yem Chasanase and Binyan Beis Mikdash, seine verbunden mit die zwei Tag von Tatuba von Yom Kippurim. Why? Matan Teire men Kippur Ishtashi Yom Kippurim Shnu Beluchas Achrenas. When we say B'yem Chasanase is a Matan Teire, we're referring to Yom Kippur. When Yom Kippur is the day when the Eibusher Moshe brought down the second Luchais, which was the culmination of Matan Teire that began 4 months earlier on Shavuos. So when we say Matan Torah, we don't mean Shavuos, we mean Yom Kippur. The one is the Eibusher's greatest joy on Yom Kippur. And Beis Hamikdash, and so how does Beis Hamikdash fit in over here? Says the Marsha, Achamisha Aser Ba'av Koi. This is a reference to Chamisha Aser Ba'av. Shetayim Simcha Seitluim B'Binyan Hamikdash. That the dates, that the Simcha of Chamisha Aser Ba'av is connected with the building of the Beis Hamikdash. So when it says in the Mishnah, Zeb Binyan Beis Hamikdash, it's referring to the 15th of Av. Was die einzige Sache mit was tu ba'av hat Ashayachas Gluya zu Binyan HaMikdash. Where do you see any connection between the date, the 15th of Av, and the building of the Beis HaMikdash? Is was das is der Yom Shepaskum Nechasetz in the Maracha. It's the day that they stopped cutting wood for the Sheba Mikdash, for the fire in the Mizbech that was in the Beis HaMikdash. So we see that these 2 days, Yom Kippur and Yom Kippur and Chamish Asar Ba'av, are connected with the Simcha of the Eibishter. So the Simcha of Chamisha Asar B'Av is primarily because of the fact that they stopped cutting wood. So now we're going to ask the same question. It's true that the idea of cutting wood is a great mitzvah. The word mitzvah gedela is a quote here from the Rishonim in the previous paragraph. The Rebbe in the other references a different sikh in Likkutei Sichos where he actually discusses what is the mitzvah gedela. The Rebbe explains elsewhere that because the wood is helping other people bring karbanis, therefore it's an inyan of tzedakah, and tzedakah is equal to all other mitzvahs. And also, this leads that the Beis Hamikdash should reach its completion, as we learned in last week's sikha and in numerous previous times. Now, one of the elements of the Beis Hamikdash is bayis muchan la'akriv karbanis. Excuse me. To be a home, a structure that is ready, prepared to bring karbanos. Without wood, you can't bring a carbon. So by bringing the wood, you are bringing the Beis Hamikdash to its completion. And therefore, it's a mitzvah gedayla. So it's true that chopping the wood is a mitzvah gedayla. But it's still only a facilitation of a mitzvah. Since blaze at tafel tzmikir, it's only secondary. The akravas are karbanis lakabim mizbech. The actual primary avodah was to bring the karbanis. So why are we making such a big deal out of chopping the wood? Is vikumtis adavka krisis eitzim. So why is it that the chopping of the wood is such a major, great thing? Bees at the shaft a yomtiv is aggressive and alle andere yomtivim that it generates a yomtiv that is greater than all of the yomtivim. Basis by the kabbanis asmam gefindt man it as his own gerim than yomtiv v'simcha gedela. Whereas by the kabbanis themselves, you don't find it to become such a great simcha. So that's the question. So now we basically have 3 things that we have to explain. Number 1, why is wood considered a carbon, a part of a carbon, and because of that you can bring it as its own independent carbon if the wood is only machshirei mitzvah, if the wood is only facilitating the carbon. Number 2, why was the day of Nidvas HaEitzim, the days of Nidvas HaEitzim, why were they such a great simcha? What was so great about it that it could even override Tisha B'Av Nidcha? And why was Krisas Eitzim? Why was the day of the chopping of the wood, or the day that they finished chopping the wood, why is that such a great simcha that it's considered the greatest yontiv, greater than any other yontiv? Stay with the beer and them, and now we're going to begin the beer. Now that we're a good 50% in to the sikha, we are finally ready for the beer, and we're going to understand. First, we have to understand what's a carbon. Once we understand what is a carbon, we'll understand why the eitzim, why the wood plays such a fundamental, integral role in the carbon. It is well known what the Ramban explains in the meaning from Karbonis, as there was bringt a carbon, dafür as meise betrachten sich, that someone who brings a carbon has to at that time think to himself, adas was der krav, ukloyus, ukrayim, from the carbon, the fact that the innards and the kidneys and the legs of the carbon, are being burnt on the Mizbeach, and we're sprinkling his blood on the Mizbeach, his vial, is because he is worthy that his own blood should be sprinkled. And his body should be burned. If not for the kindness of Hashem that takes a substitute instead of him, the blood of the animal in the place of the blood of the person, and the soul of the animal in place of the soul of the person. In other words, the kavanah von a carbon is, as they mentioned, zich makriv sein zum Eibishter. The intent of the carbon is a person should offer himself to Hashem. No, the Eibishter performed a kindness with this person who wants to bring a carbon. And the Eibishter substituted the literal offering of oneself for the offering of a behemoth. Aber die Akrave darf immer sein. Soll sein Nefesh, Makriv sein, Beruchnis, Nebishten. But the fact that he's bringing a carbon and he sees what's happening with this animal has to awaken within him the fact that he has to be ready, at least on a spiritual level, to offer his soul to the Eibishter. And following this reasoning, we can explain this concept that every single carbon, regardless of what the carbon is, it gets burned on the Mizbeach together with the wood of the pyre. Karban, and Rebbe explains, Karbanis teilen sich in verschiedene Sugim. Karbanis have the various different categories. When jeder Sug hat seine besondere Dinim, wie Azeir wird nicht vergangen. And every category of carbon has its own set of laws in what manner it has to be brought onto the Mizbeach. For example, you have a carbon oila that's totally burned on the Mizbeach. You have a carbon shlamim, and only parts of it are burned on the Mizbeach, etc. According to the explanation of the Ramban, that the Ramban says that the carbon is taking the place of the person, is verstandig, is understood. The reason why every single type of carbon has its own set of dinim is because these dinim are consistent with the purpose of that specific carbon. Was their carbon that in the makriv, that which whatever that carbon has to accomplish within the person that's bringing it. Welchen teil von sich is makriv zum Eibishter, which part of himself is he offering up to Hashem? But does his behesem to the sibah from the carbon, which would be consistent with why he's bringing the carbon in the first place? Is it a kapara afachet? Is it atonement for a sin? Nedava, is it just a donation? V'chulu. So, based on why he needs the carbon, is what the carbon is meant to accomplish. And based on what the carbon is meant to accomplish, there will be different dinim that are consistent with the goal of the specific carbon. And we could see this in the explanation of the Ramban himself. As that even some of the more general things that the Ramban mentions, the fact that we burn the innards of the animal, the fact that the blood is sprinkled, don't exist by all the karbanis. For example, by a carbon mincha, a mincha is nicht verbunden mit krav v'chulu und dam von dem makriv. The mincha would not be connected with the insides or with the blood of the person bringing a carbon, and therefore the mincha has no need to there's no blood to sprinkle. There's nothing, and there's no innards to burn on the mizbeach. So we see that the very fact that the Ramban mentions things that don't exist by all the karbanis it teaches us that every carbon has its own set of laws consistent with the goal of this specific carbon as it relates to this specific person and why he has to bring this carbon. On the other hand, however, there is an underlying foundation to every carbon. The fact that the person is offering up himself to Hashem. Das heißt, im allem ersten muss beim Adam sein die klolestige Greatkeit, zu sich meise Nefesh sein zum Fahren Ebersten, that any carbon has to have a general attitude and readiness that the person is giving up himself, his life, to and for the Eibishter, but das ist nicht verbunden mit einer bestimmten Chelik, hat der Prater mentioned, that is not connected to a specific aspect of the person, but Akrava von Etzem Nafs den ganzen Behus. The readiness that is to give up his entire being to Hashem. That's the starting point. Now by jeden zu Korban wird auch die Akrava von Etzem Nafshi ausgedrückt, bepeil in verschiedene Praten von the Menschen. And then by every type of korban, this general readiness of the person to offer up himself entirely then is expressed in actuality in certain details of the person. So you have the general hakrava of the whole person, which is the attitude that a person is approaching this with, and then when it comes into actuality, he has to pick and choose what needs to be fixed right now, and I'm going to bring a korban that works with that. Und das ist der Linie von der Yatzei Haracha. So now we understand what is the purpose, what is the idea of the wood. Was werden verbrennt al Mizbeach zusammen mit jedem korban that are burned on the Mizbeach together with any korban. Das ist die Tmura von der Klolis Diker Tzad Hashava, Hakrava von der Matam HaMakriv. This is the substitute of the general, common theme of every korban, the readiness to give oneself up. From the Matam HaMakriv, from the person who's bringing the korban to Hashem, which is necessary by every single korban. So, you now understand that just like the Ramban says by every korban, that korban is a tumura, it's a substitute for the person himself. Also the wood plays a role here. The wood is the substitute of the general attitude of hakrava that affects the entire person before he gets to the point where he's focusing on one specific aspect of himself and elevating it and giving it up to Hashem. Und damit sich move was das ist Merumas in der Minion von Eitzem Davke. And it's also understood why this idea, the idea of the hakrava of the whole person, is alluded to in or is substituted with the idea of wood. Weil ha'adam eitz hasada, because the person is a tree. The human being is compared to the tree of the field. And Adam is eitz hasada. Das heißt, as eitz, an eitz drikt us, nicht bloß a gewissen Teil of the Praten von dem Adam, a tree represents not just a part of the person, nor die ganze Sache von Adam. The tree represents the whole concept of a person. And therefore, if we want to talk about the hakrava of the whole person, one of the ways to do that is with wood, which comes from a tree. And there's even a deeper part over here, which is brings from a different sicha. That it's specifically in the aspect of the growing things, the world of growing, which even though it's on a lower level, let's say, than the animal kingdom, or on a lower level than the human, nevertheless, the pnimius, the essence of the soul, is expressed in the concept of tzemeach. Similar to a tree that is always connected, the roots. As long as a tree is alive, it's connected to its source, to its roots. Its roots are connected to its source. In other words, and therefore by a yid, by a person, the tzemeach, the aspect of tzemeach in the person represents the fact that the person is always connected, which is why it represents the pnimius nefesh, which is always connected, the deepest part of the neshama, which is always connected to lukus. So from this we see some very, very fundamental characteristics in the concept of wood, of a tree. Number one, that it's connected to its root, and number two, that it references the entire person. And therefore, the idea of the hakrava of the whole person is represented in the eitzim. So when a person brings a korban, the actual hakrava of the korban, the chelev v'dam, that would represent the specific aspects of the person as he elevates them and connects them to, and brings them closer to Hashem. But in that very same korban, you also have the yesod of the foundation of the korban, which is a hakrava, the general attitude of I'm ready to give my entire being up to Hashem, and that is represented in the atzei hamaracha in the wood. Und das ist echt der Tam b'pnimis ha'inyanim. This explains why the donation of the wood generated this incredible simcha, even greater than the actual korban. While the inyan von atzei maracha is nitnor, but this is nitkin stama zaytikin tafel the inyan in a korban ahech shelachud, because the idea of being makriv a korban of the wood, is not just that it's a side thing, it's a secondary thing, it's a facilitator of the mitzvah. That adarabah does the klal and you say it for the inyan korbanos. The wood represents the most fundamental aspect of the karbonis. And therefore, when we donated the wood, it generated an incredible simcha. And Licha'eda, at this point, we now have the answer to our original question. What is the svara that wood should be considered part of a carbon if it's only a hechsher mitzvah? It's not only a hechsher mitzvah. Halachically speaking, yes, the wood of the maracha is a hechsher mitzvah. It's not an ingredient of a carbon. But the way the Rebbe is explaining this Ramban, the wood is fundamental aspect of the carbon, and therefore certainly it could be considered part of the carbon, and therefore that is the svara, that is the logical reason why when our pasuk says v'chisakriv carbon, it could include eitzim, because eitzim has the same carbon Allah. Eitzim has the name of a carbon because it is the klal and the yusaid of the idea of the karbanos. So that question is answered, but the Rebbe is still going to continue to explain even better, even more, the difference between hakrava klalis, the general hakrava, the general readiness of the person to offer himself up to Hashem, and the hakrava pratis, the specific ways of bringing a carbon of oneself, as it is substituted in the behemoth. One of the general differences between the general readiness to give oneself up to Hashem and the akrava, which is expressed in the wood of the ma'aracha, of the Mizbeach, und der akrava pratis, and the individual akrava, the specific akrava, which would be consistent with the various details of whatever specific carbon, respective carbon, the person is bringing, is as follows. If a person is involved with offering up, bringing closer one specific aspect of the person, a tail von seinem Metzias, a part of his Metzias, he can't totally undress himself from himself. Sein Bittul Mesidus Nefesh is angetan in sein Keach Prati. The idea of hakrava, bringing a carbon, is bittul. A person is giving oneself away to Hashem, but it's entirely focused on this specific koyach. So there's a bunch of other parts of the person that are not being addressed. Those parts haven't yet enjoyed the bittul. The focus on this one specific kayach covers up on his bittul Mesiris Nefesh, because he wants to fix his heart. But there's a mind, and there's all these other parts of the person, and those other parts cover up on the Mesiris Nefesh that he's ready to experience in the area of his heart. But if a person is still at the point where he's entirely ready to give himself up to Hashem, is giving himself up entirely to Hashem, there's nothing that's going to block the Mesiris Nefesh. In a bittul klali, because he stands in a total bittul to the Eibishter. At that point, he is dedicating himself and giving himself away to Hashem in a way that's higher than understanding and higher than feeling. Even if it's a holy logic and a holy feeling. Und das ist der Tam, was die Eitzim Shebechol Korban werden gebracht, nicht als a Teil von Etzem HaKorban, nor als a besondere Sach a Hechsher Korban. And this explains why the Eitzim, the wood, are not considered to be part of the carbon. They're considered to be a Hechsher carbon, something that facilitates the carbon. Because l'cheira, if the carbon is, like we just explained, that Eitzim is the most fundamental aspect of the carbon, and yet it's only a hechsher carbon. Why? If it's such a fundamental part of the carbon, it should be the carbon, or at least part of the carbon. But now that we understand that there's hakrava klalis and hakrava pratis, there's a specific hakrava which a person is focused on one part of himself, and the rest of himself is blocking this bittul Mesiris Nefesh. And then there's the union of hakrava klalis, which is represented in the wood, in which the bittul Mesiris Nefesh is much more complete. This will explain why the wood is considered, it was only a hechsher carbon. See, it seems like a Like it's lower than everything else. In an oifen was is Deiche Tisha B'Av. And similarly, when we talk about the simcha of these days of the donation of the wood, which was done in a manner that it overrides Tisha B'Av Nidche, was the sibes simcha is nit nur die akrava atzma from karbanos eilis nedava, which the reason why we have the joy on those days is not, like we said in the name of the Achreinim before, that we're bringing karbanis. Or the Kedasa Ritva from the carbon Eitzmo. Earlier we said that the Ritva holds that they actually brought wood as a carbon. Even that aspect is not what caused the joy. No, the sibe is davke the etzem nidvas eitzim the maracha. Kanal Sif Dalid. The simcha is the fact that they donated wood, which is not yet a carbon. Which is the same question. Number one, we're saying that the wood in any carbon, the wood is a hechsher carbon. It facilitates the carbon. It's not part of the carbon. And similarly, the joy is the fact that we're donating the wood, not that we're using the wood for a carbon or as a carbon. Vayol. And now we get to the reason that Bavais of Mesiris Nefesh B'Shleimus is the Ibig Gebenkeit zu Machshirei carbon mitzvah. Because where do you see that the Mesiris Nefesh has reached its peak is when a person is dedicated to those things that are only the facilitators of the mitzvah. Ben Aid bringt a carbon af Mizbeach afilu as a carbon was wird in ganzen verbrennt elo und sein Matzis wird bottle. When a Yid brings the carbon, even the type of carbon like a carbon oila that entirely gets burned, which represents the person is giving up his whole being. Can der makriv trachten? The person bringing it could think to himself, even though here he abnegated his entire existence. But at least he accomplished something. That it's a pleasant aroma for Hashem. The Eibishter has nachas, pleasure from the fact that the Eibishter made a request and his will was fulfilled. So a person thinks to himself, I am batel, but at least I made the Eibishter happy. Nowhere do we find that the very fact that wood is burning on the Mizbeach causes a pleasure to Hashem. And at the same time, they're losing their entire existence. They're being burned on the Mizbeach. Is there by nita der hergish atzmai? There's no self-feeling here. There's no feeling of self, of accomplishment. Ader her as a tu and Hashem, a feeling, an understanding that they are accomplishing something great for Hashem. The wood doesn't feel like they did anything. The wood is being burned entirely, and it doesn't even get the satisfaction of reach necheach Hashem. Zeir Pul is, what did the wood accomplish? All the accomplished was that someone else should be able to cause a nachas to Hashem. As we see it actually in the donation of the wood, as the uftu from another than the eitzim is bastanden, in der meglichen, the whole great accomplishment of donating wood consisted of the fact that it made it possible as a zweiter Yid. So can bring in a carbon, that another Yid could be able to bring a carbon and cause pleasure to Hashem. Und die Greatkeit, sich avegem von Inyan, is der Beweis of the Bittul Mesiris Nefesh B'Shleimus, carbon la Hashem. This shows that the person has reached the greatest level of Mesiris Nefesh. That a person, not only are they giving themselves up entirely, but they're giving themselves up entirely for something that has no great feeling at the end. There's no feeling of nachas ruach, of reach necheach la Hashem. All you can feel is, I did all the hard work so that someone else could be able to bring a carbon and have the satisfaction of bringing reach necheach Hashem. So in Seif Zayin, after understanding that the Atzei Me'aracha are an integral part of the carbon, we ask, in that case, why is it only a hechsher carbon? And at the same token, we ask, why was the simcha on the donation of the wood about the donating the wood and not about the fact that it was later used for karbonis? And the answer is because the fact that it's a hechsher carbon is the greatest sign, that the greatest indication that this is a true and sincere Mesiris Nefesh, where the person can't even walk away with a feeling that he made a nachas to the Eibishter. The best he has is that he helped someone else give a nachas to the Eibishter. So this explains to us the greatness of Nidvas HaEitzim, the great simcha of Nidvas HaEitzim, the fact that it is so fundamental in serving Hashem, the Hakrav Klolis, the general attitude of being ready to give oneself up for Hashem, with very, very little kickback. In Sivchas, we're going to say that in a sense, there's an even greater aspect of Bittul Mesiris Nefesh, and that comes with the chopping of the wood. After all this, after this whole deep explanation, we're going to see that even the donating of the wood is not a complete indication of a complete and total dedication to Hashem. Even though he doesn't feel that he accomplished anything, he still could feel some satisfaction. The fun was the Eitzim that given kodesh, because this wood, at least he took something mundane, made it holy. Which will ultimately lead to be able to bring a carbon. At least he knows they did something. The highest level of bringing a carbon to Hashem without mixing in any personal feelings, in the meaning for Kristus Eitz and the Maracha, is expressed in the chopping or the cutting of the wood for the Maracha. When we're cutting wood, trees in the field, before it was brought to the treasurer or whoever was in charge of the wood shaper. And this is specifically seen for those families who brought the wood after the 15th of Av. For example, the 20th of Av was for the family of Pachas Me'av ben Yehuda, and the 20th of Elul there was another family, V'chulu. Warum? Von ein Seite haben sie die Eitzim gemusst schneiden, nicht später wie Chamish Asher B'Av. On the one hand, they had to cut the wood before the 15th of Av, as I mentioned earlier, while they're not saying Pasal Maracha, because after the 15th of Av, they are not kosher to be used for the fire in the Mizbeach. Aber leider kisse, haben sie nicht gekannt gleich bringen, mag zu sein, die Eitzim, they couldn't bring it right away. Well, because had they donated, let's say they cut it on Yud Av, or then, and right away it became Hagdish, then it would already belong to the Eibishter. Anything that is in the storage houses of Hashem belongs to the Eibishter. And then by the Chaf Av, by the 20th of Av, the wood wouldn't be theirs to be able to donate it. The whole point of those days was they should bring their wood and donate it to the Mizbeach. If it was Kodesh already from the time of the chopping, then it wouldn't be theirs to donate it. Kumtuis, as the Allah text is in the Krisis Eitzim and Nidvas Eitzim, that all those days between the chopping of the wood and the donating of the wood, Zayin the Eitzim Bazegiv and Atzechulin. The logs, the wood, was regular mundane wood. Und der Mit is moving, so from this we understand, as in der Pulas Achana from Krisis Eitzim, then the act of preparing this wood by chopping the wood, in Velcha zet nit on Kedusha, where you don't see any holiness whatsoever. Is that the full and this represents the total dedication to Hashem. In a for Bittul Mitzias Legamri, in a manner of a total Bittul Mitzias, woman trachten ganzen nicht wegen sich, where you're not thinking about oneself at all, wegen was ich hab aufgetan, what did I accomplish, nor blaze, ton for neighbors, wegen I'm doing it only for Hashem. In other words, the very fact that I'm doing all this work for a Hechsher carbon, not even a carbon itself, but an extra carbon. But at this point, I don't even have the satisfaction of making it kodesh. I chopped the wood and the wood remained choil. That is, there's so little self in that is the ultimate expression of bittul, where I'm doing something and I see nothing. At this point, I see no accomplishment whatsoever. I didn't even get it to the point that it could be a extra carbon. It's just regular logs sitting in my storage house. Underfar. Der Gedel aflav chamisha sabav, bis as lihoyu yomim teven lisot chamisha sabav v'chim kippurim, and therefore it is such a great time, a great day, the 15th of Av. The simcha for chamisha sabav is bedugmat sheyem kippurim, achas b'shana. The simcha of chamisha sabav, the 15th of Av, is compared to Yom Kippur, which is known as the achas b'shana, the once a year, and as it's explained in Chassidus when it's written, "Nizgala b'yeden niden sein achas shebenefesh b'chinas yichida, achas sheb'shana, the day that my achas the oneness of my soul, which is my Yechida, the highest level of my soul is revealed in Yom Kippur. The fact that a Yid could rejoice in the fact that that he is chopping wood ultimately for the Mizbeach, and it remains in his own possession as mundane logs. That the person could feel joy in that. That comes from the level of Yechid, which the whole point of Yechid is liyachdach, to celebrate the oneness of Hashem. And this level of joy, where a person did nothing, so to speak, and yet feels that great joy that he's part of something, that represents the Yechidah Shebenefesh. So this explains the simcha of Nidvas Eitzim, why the day of Nidvasim was such a great simcha, because it represented the aveklig, the giving oneself up and total dedication to Hashem, that even though it's only a hechsher carbon, even though it's something that it's only going to help someone else bring a carbon, nevertheless, a person is happy to do Mesidus Nefesh for Hashem. And then higher than that is Knisas Ha'etzim L'Ma'aracha, is chopping the wood, where a person doesn't even have that satisfaction that he's creating a hechsher carbon. We also understand why Eitzim could be brought as a carbon b'fnei atzmai, because since Eitzim are integrally part of a carbon, they are the yesod, the foundation of the carbon. Therefore, it has the name of carbon, and therefore, when the pasuk says v'chisakriv carbon, it could include Eitzim wood as a carbon b'fnei atzmai. The Rebbe is going to continue and to connect these three types. So far, it turns out that there's three aspects in the wood. There's the carbon ha'eitzim. There's the fact that wood could be an actual carbon, which means that it has the inherent value of being used as a carbon. Then there's the fact that the eitzim is used for the ma'aracha, donated and used for the ma'aracha, for the fire in the mizbeach, which is as it's helping someone else or something else to bring a carbon to Hashem. And then there's the chopping of the wood, which at that moment it seems to have no holy value, and yet it is the greatest simcha, because that is the greatest Mesidus Nefesh. And the Rebbe is going to compare those three ideas with three things that we see in the celebration of the 15th of Av. We can connect the description of the celebrations of Chamisha Asar B'Av as it is taught in the end of Masechta Tainis, and the theme of the day of Chamisha Asar B'Av. The Mishnah says, as Betu B'Av, v'Yom Kippurim, that on the 15th of Av and on Yom Kippur, B'Neis Yushalayim Yitzes v'Chelis B'Chramim, the daughters of Yerushalayim, the maidens of Yerushalayim would go out and dance in the vineyards. U'maha Yo'emris, and what would they say? Bachar Sanai Necha. To the young man, raise up your eyes and see which person interests you. That's the Mishnah. And the Braisa in the Mefaret later, on the last Amid of the Masechta, the Braisa actually elaborates. As then when there were three categories. Yaf Yafiye Shebehen Ma'ayimris, the pretty ones, the beautiful ones. What would they say? Tnuei Nechem Le'Yofi. Lay your eyes on the beauty. Sheina Isha Le'Yofi, because a woman is for beauty. Miyuchas Shebehen, those who had lineage. Ma'ayimris, what would they say? Tnuei Nechem Le'Mishpacha. Put your eyes on the family. Sheina Isha Le'Labanim, because the woman is there to bring children. So if it comes, the Rebbe will mention soon, the Rashi, if they come from good stock, then the children will be good, healthy, smart, whatever. Those who were not beautiful, what did they say? Take your acquisition for the sake of Shemayim. In other words, there isn't really anything in it for you. There's no yoifi, there's no special banim, but l'shem shamayim, you marry l'shem shamayim. Of course, this Gemara needs to be understood more at depth, and many of the Mefarshim talk about it. We're not really going into the Pashta Pshat in the Gemara, but the Rebbe is going to say is that these three things represent three levels in Aveda that are consistent with the with the three types of Eitzim. that these three categories are consistent with the three types of the wood that we spoke about. There's certain wood that they themselves become a carbon on the Mizbeach, which is what the Sikha started with. Carbon teaches us you're allowed to bring wood as its own independent carbon. Hasam Lazay is that Eshter Sug Bonis, the Yafyafiyas, which would be consistent with the first category, those that had in them beauty. Beauty is an inherent value. It's something that is about the person themselves. The person is a beautiful person. So this represents the wood that is able to be a carbon. It takes that beauty and what's beautiful? Beautiful that it's a spiritual beauty that that he's offering himself up to Hashem. Then you have the wood that was used for the fire, that as they're being donated and brought into the chamber of the wood, which was on those specific days that were celebrated as days of the wood, which are compared to those that we are referring to as those of lineage. Which the greatness of yichus, of lineage, affects the children. If the children have lineage, everyone's going to marry them or be with them. So you're in this case, the marriage with this type of person would be for the children that come from it. Carbon, similar to the wood and the mizbeach that are facilitating the other person's carbon. It's not a value that you gain in it for yourself, but it's a value that you're helping somebody else. And when the wood was merely chopped, cut for the mizbeach, they're still mundane, and you don't see any connection to holiness. This would be compared to those who weren't beautiful, which seemingly don't have any revealed special qualities. But at that same token, because these ones did not have any inner qualities, so to speak, therefore that connection is very clearly and obviously for the sake of Shamayim, for the sake nitfar zich, not for oneself, not for what will I gain out of this, nor blois for an eberstens weg, and I'm doing it for Hashem. But which is similar to what we explained before, that specifically when it comes to the chopping of the wood, we see the total dedication to do what Hashem wants, what Hashem needs, without any personal motives. We're not doing it for ourselves. We're doing it totally for the Eibishter. So dafke, when you do something where you don't see what you're going to gain from it, you don't even see how someone else is going to gain from it. You don't see any quality here. And when you do that and to serve Hashem in that way, that is the ultimate bittul where it's l'shem shamayim. And now we have a practical lesson in everyone's aveda. And if I understand it, meaning that those who believe that in for simcha v'edes Hashem, when can I truly be joyful in serving Hashem? Is when he turns over the world. If you learn the entire Torah or something on that level, he did something major, incredible. But if it merely was helping another yid, as the will kennen this kind of information that the other person should be able to become closer to Hashem, is one can say, why is this such a great simcha? What did I gain out of this? Is the Eirah. So the lesson that we're learning from this wood, from this nidvas ha'etzim and krisas ha'etzim, it's true that if a person had the ability to do more for himself and didn't, then there's consequences for that. On the other hand, you can't the negativity of not working on oneself does not take away the positivity of helping another yid. And with regards to this mitzvah of helping another yid become closer to Hashem, Zog Teira, as he brings to the Geresta Simcha V'Nala Simchas, Teira tells us, when Teira tells us there's no greater simcha than Chamisha Asab'av, the Teira is telling us that helping another yid is the greatest possible simcha. There's no greater simcha than that. That is the greatest simcha of the year, the time that we help another yid, the time when it's not about us, even if we don't see any personal gain from this, we don't even see any accomplishment in this, but we're doing it solely for the Eibishter and to help another yid. This is the greatest simcha.